In this quick intro to English style brioche knitting, we're going to look at slip-1 yarn over, brioche knit and brioche purl stitches. We're going to work with 2 contrasting colors and 2 DPNs, or you can use a set of circular needles as well. I'm going to start by casting on an odd number of stitches with my lighter color, and I'm going to use a long tail cast on for this one here. I'm going to cast on 11 stitches, and that means I'm going to actually have only 9 stitches for my brioche pattern, and the first and the last stitch are going to be selvage stitches. So after casting on, you can see that there's only single loops in our needles, and what's so characteristic about brioche are those yarn overs that are crossing over every other stitch. So in this first row, which is going to be a setup row, we're going to establish those yarn overs that are characteristic for brioche. Still need to hold the yarn in my right hand, sorry about that, for English style knitting. So the first stitch of every row is going to be a selvage stitch, and that's going to be a knit 1 selvage stitch here at the beginning. And after that, there's already our first basic brioche stitch, and that's a slip-1 yarn over. So this next stitch is going to be a slip-1 yarn over stitch. So we bring the yarn to the front between the needles, and we slip the stitch purlwise with yarn in front. And we don't actually have to do a yarn over physically. So because the yarn is already in front from slipping the stitch, and we're going to knit the next stitch, what happens is that the yarn travels over the needle to the back, because the yarn for the knit stitch comes from the back. So we don't have to make a yarn over when we work a knit stitch after a slip-1 yarn over stitch. So by making the next stitch as a knit one, you can see that the yarn travels over the needle to the back, and without actually having to do a yarn over, you get this yarn over the stitch that was slipped before. So that's a bit of a magic of English style slip-1 yarn overs with knits. Afterwards, we work another knit stitch and another slip-1 yarn over stitch. So we bring the yarn to the front again, slip the next stitch purlwise, and knit the next stitch. So this is the slip-1 yarn over stitch when there is a knit stitch following. It's going to be different when we follow the slip-1 yarn over up with a purl stitch or a brioche purl stitch. But for the knits or brioche knit stitch following a slip-1 yarn over, this is the way to do it. And one last slip-1 yarn over before the selvage. So we bring the yarn to the front, slip the last slip-1 yarn over stitch purlwise, and what you see now is the last stitch is not going to be knit, it's going to be slipped for each slip-1 with yarn in front selvage stitch. So what we need to do is we actually have to finish this slip-1 yarn over stitch, otherwise it will not have that yarn over it. So we actually have to physically do that yarn over before we slip the last stitch purlwise with the yarn in front, otherwise you're going to lose that yarn over. So in this case, it's different than we had done in the other slip-1 yarn over stitches in that row. So when I spread out these stitches now in my needles, what you see is that every other stitch has this yarn over that travels diagonally over the needle, over the stitch. It starts before the stitch and it travels over the needle, over the stitch, to the back of the needle, to the back of the book, and it crosses that stitch. And the stitch and the yarn over, they're considered one single item, one thing, so you would count them as one stitch, and you'd also treat them as one stitch later on when we work the creases. So let's turn around and start our first full brioche row. This is our first right side row, the first pass of the right side row, and we start again with a knit 1 selvage stitch. And the next stitch here is already our second basic brioche stitch. You can see that this is a stitch that has 2 loops, so the stitch and the yarn over that crosses over it. And that means that we're going to need to work this stitch, and we're going to work it as a brioche knit stitch. So we're going to insert the needle as if to knit those 2 together, just like a normal knit 2 together. But because the stitch and the yarn over are considered one single item, we call it a brioche knit, because a knit 2 together would be a decrease, but we don't actually change the stitch count. So it's the same motion, but because we don't decrease, it's called a brioche knit. Then we bring the yarn to the front and slip the next stitch, just like we had done in the previous row, purlwise. And because the next stitch is again another knit stitch, another brioche knit stitch. So it works the same way for the slip-1 yarn over. We don't have to do that extra motion for the yarn over. It happens automatically because we're going to knit the next stitch. Then we bring the yarn to the front again, slip 1 yarn over. The yarn over happens automatically when we do the next brioche knit. Bring the yarn to the front and slip the stitch purlwise for the slip 1 yarn over stitch. The yarn is still in front, and when you do the brioche knit, it travels to the back over the needle, and it makes that yarn over on the stitch before. And we continue to the last stitch, another brioche knit, and the last stitch of the row is a selvage stitch. And we bring the yarn to the front and slip the selvage stitch purlwise with yarn in front. So this is the first pass of our right side row finished, and what we need to do now is we hold on to the knitting, to the stitches, and we push the needle through, and that will make it possible to knit a second right side row with our second color. So in brioche you have to knit 2 passes of every row. And when we work with 2 colors, we work 2 right side rows followed by 2 wrong side rows. So I'm attaching now my second color to work a second right side row with that second color. And it's a little fiddly here on the first stitch when we attach a new yarn. So just hold on tight and try to just get that first selvage stitch knit somehow. So this is the knit 1 selvage stitch. And as soon as if you've knit that, it should be anchored a little and not move around too much. Okay, so ready for the next row. This next stitch is a single loop stitch, and that tells you that it needs to be worked as a slip 1 yarn over stitch. So I bring the yarn to the front and I slip the next stitch purlwise. Let's have a look at the next stitch on our needles. It's a double stitch, so it needs to be worked, and I can see a purl bump there. And the purl bump tells me, you can see the purl bump right here. The purl bump tells me that this needs to be worked as a brioche purl stitch. So this is the third basic stitch that we are looking at now. And because the purl is a little different than the knit, we actually have to physically make this yarn over now and bring the yarn back to the front so we can brioche purl the next stitch. The brioche purl is just like the brioche knit. We purl the stitch together with its yarn over. So insert the needle purlwise through both loops and purl them together. I'm sorry, I'm a little rusty on my English style purls, but I'll get into the groove of it in a moment. Okay, the next stitch is a single stitch. My yarn is already in front from the brioche purl, so I can simply slip the stitch purlwise. And because the next one is again another purl stitch, another brioche purl, I know I need to actually physically do the yarn over again this time. So when we have a purl or a brioche purl following the slip 1 yarn over, you have to physically make this yarn over for the slip 1 yarn over. And when we have a knit or a brioche knit following the slip 1 yarn over, you don't have to do that. But for the purl stitch following, just like here with the brioche purl, you need to make that yarn over. The yarn is already in front, slip purlwise and yarn over and brioche purl. Another slip-on yarn over stitch, and then the yarn is already in front, so I can slip my selvage stitch with yarn in front purlwise, and I finished my second pass of the right side row. So you can see that both tail ends, both working yarns, are hanging on the same side of the work, and this is your indication that you just finished both passes of one row, and you can turn around and start on the next row. This is going to be a wrong side row, and I switch colors again, so I'm going back to the gray yarn, and I start my first pass of the wrong side row again with a knit one selvage stitch. The next stitch is a double stitch, so it has two loops, the stitch and the yarn over, and I can see this purl bump here as well. So I know that it's going to be a brioche purl stitch, so I'm purling the stitch together with its yarn over. And the yarn is already in front from the purl, and I slip the next stitch as a slip-on yarn over purlwise, and because this is a purl row, I need to do the yarn overs for the slip-on yarn over. They don't happen automatically like on the knit rows. I have to slip one, yarn over in two separate steps. And then I continue working with brioche purl, slip one yarn over until I reach my selvage stitch at the end of the row. Last brioche purl here. And the tail end, the yarn is already in front, so I can slip my selvage stitch purlwise. I pull a little to tighten it, and then you can see that one yarn is on one side and one is on the other, and I just worked a gray row, so I need to work a pink row now. And to be able to actually get to where the pink starts, where the pink yarn is attached, I need to slide my stitches again, so I can start another wrong side row with my second color. So I've been sliding the stitches to the other tip of the needle. The first stitch is again a knit one selvage stitch, and the next stitch is a single loop, so that tells me it's going to be a slip-on yarn over stitch. And this next stitch here, the one that has two loops, the stitch and the yarn over, you can see below that is a knit stitch. So I'm going to be working the next one as a brioche knit, and that means that I don't have to physically make that yarn over. The yarn is already in front, and when I make the brioche knit, it automatically also makes that yarn over on the previous stitch. So this is another row where we don't have to make that yarn over, it makes itself, which is nice. So we're going to work this row with brioche knit and slip-on yarn over until we reach the selvage stitch at the end of the row. Slip one yarn over without actually doing the yarn over part, and brioche knit. Bring the yarn to the front again, slip the single loop, brioche knit the doubled loops. And once more, bring to the front and slip. And because we don't knit the selvage stitch, we don't knit that one, so we actually have to physically make that last yarn over before we can slip the selvage stitch purlwise with the yarn in front. And that is the second pass of the wrong side row finished. Both tail ends, both yarn ends are again on the same side. We can turn around, and what you can see here now is that the brioche knit stitches on this side here are in gray. And that means that the gray color is going to be the dominant one on this side, on the right side. And when we turn around to the wrong side, you can see that the brioche knit stitches, those little V's here, are in pink. And that means that this is going to be the dominant color on the other side. So you can just continue like that and knit brioche.